They called her Noodle Arms behind her back, laughing as the 5 feet 4 inches European flight engineer struggled to turn manual valve wheels that seasoned pilots handled with ease. For 2 years, Flora Garcia endured the whispers, the eye rolls, the suggestions that maybe she should consider a desk job. But when a catastrophic hydraulic failure left a fully loaded C-130 Hercules plummeting toward the Mediterranean with 47 souls on board, those same weak arms would be the only thing standing between disaster and salvation. For 6 grueling hours, Flora would prove that strength isn't measured in muscle mass. It's measured in the refusal to let go, even when your body is screaming to quit. The morning briefing at Ramstein Air Base started at 0545 sharp, but Flora Garcia had been awake since 0300. She stood in the pre-flight hangar, her small hands wrapped around a steaming cup of espresso that had already gone lukewarm, watching the German sunrise paint the tarmac in shades of amber and gold. The massive C-130 Hercules transport aircraft loomed before her like a sleeping giant, its 4 turboprop engines silent but ready. At 24, Flora cut an unlikely figure among the aircrew. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches and weighing perhaps 115 pounds, she looked more like a university student than a flight engineer responsible for one of the military's most critical aircraft systems. Her colleagues had nicknamed her Garcia the Gentle during training, a supposedly affectionate reference to her soft-spoken demeanor and what they perceived as her delicate build. Behind her back, the name was less kind, Noodle Arms, whispered with barely concealed amusement, whenever she struggled with the heavy manual controls that older aircraft still required. Flora had grown up in Valencia, Spain, the daughter of an aircraft mechanic and a mathematics professor. Her childhood had been spent in hangars, learning the intricate dance of hydraulics, electronics, and mechanical systems that kept aircraft aloft. She could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, could spot hydraulic leaks from across a hangar, and possessed an almost supernatural understanding of aircraft systems that impressed even veteran mechanics. But none of that seemed to matter when it came to the physical demands of her role. The C-130 Hercules was an old workhorse, first introduced in the 1950s and still flying missions across the globe. Unlike modern fly-by-wire aircraft, the Hercules required genuine physical strength to operate its manual backup systems. When hydraulic power failed, pilots had to rely on mechanical linkages and manual controls that demanded considerable arm and back strength to operate. For someone of Flora's build, these emergency procedures were a constant source of anxiety and mockery. She joined the multinational European Air Transport Wing 18 months ago, fresh from technical school with the highest scores in her class. Her theoretical knowledge was impeccable, her troubleshooting abilities legendary among instructors. But theory and practice were proving to be very different things. During training exercises, she'd watched larger, stronger colleagues effortlessly crank the manual gear extension wheels while she struggled to generate enough torque to move the same mechanisms. The morning sun climbed higher as Flora conducted her pre-flight inspection. She moved methodically around the aircraft, checking hydraulic lines, testing control surfaces, verifying that every system was functioning within parameters. This was her domain, the technical realm where her expertise shone brightest. She knew this particular C-130, tail number 840474, better than anyone on the base. She'd worked on its engines, traced its electrical systems, and could navigate its maze of components blindfolded. Other crew members began arriving for the morning briefing. Major Klaus Hoffmann, the aircraft commander, nodded curtly as he passed. Hoffmann was old-school Luftwaffe, a man who believed that aviation was a profession for the physically strong and mentally tough. He'd never openly questioned Flora's presence on his crew, but his skepticism was palpable. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the co-pilot, offered a warmer greeting. Mitchell was British RAF, one of the few women in the unit, and had become something Of a mentor to Flora, despite their different roles. The day's mission was routine by military standards. Transport a mixed cargo of medical supplies and communications equipment to allied bases across the Mediterranean. First stop would be the NATO facility in Naples, then onward to smaller installations in Greece and Cyprus. Total flight time, approximately 8 hours. Weather conditions were ideal: clear skies, minimal wind, perfect visibility. The kind of day that should have been relaxing for an experienced crew. As Flora gathered her flight gear, she overheard a conversation between two ground crew members that made her stomach tighten. "Hope we don't have any emergencies today," one was saying. Garcia's arms couldn't turn a manual valve if her life depended on it. The other laughed quietly. Maybe she should stick to checking gauges and let the real engineers handle the physical stuff. Flora pretended not to hear, but the words stung. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times. Her physical limitations had become a running joke among the maintenance crews, a source of gentle ribbing that felt less gentle each time she encountered it. The worst part was that she understood their concern. In an emergency, when hydraulic power failed and manual reversion was required, upper body strength could mean the difference between a successful landing and a catastrophe. The briefing room buzzed with the familiar energy of a routine mission as Flora slipped into her usual seat near the back. Charts and weather reports covered every available surface, while digital displays showed flight paths, fuel calculations, and cargo manifests. Major Hoffman stood at the front, his weathered face serious as he addressed the assembled crew of 12. "Today's route takes us over some of the busiest commercial airspace in Europe," Hoffman announced, his German accent adding gravitas to every word. "We'll be carrying priority medical cargo to 3 destinations. Weather is optimal, traffic is manageable, and maintenance reports show all aircraft systems nominal." Flora opened her flight engineer's manual, though she could recite most of the emergency procedures from memory. As Hoffman began assigning specific responsibilities for the mission, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. During normal operations, her role was straightforward: monitor aircraft systems, manage fuel consumption, coordinate with ground personnel for cargo operations. But military aviation always carried the possibility of emergencies, and emergencies meant manual reversion procedures. "Garcia," Hoffman's voice cut through her thoughts. "You're familiar with the hydraulic backup procedures for gear extension, correct?" "Yes, sir," Flora replied, her voice steady despite the attention suddenly focused on her. "Manual extension requires approximately 47 turns of the hand crank for main gear, 23 turns for nose gear. System pressure must be relieved first through the emergency valve sequence." Hoffman nodded approvingly, but Flora caught the subtle exchange of glances between some crew members. They knew the procedures too, but they also knew that knowing and doing were different things. Last month, during a training exercise, she'd struggled for nearly 10 minutes to complete a manual gear extension that Sergeant Weber, the backup flight engineer, had completed in 3. Captain Mitchell spoke up from her position near the flight planning table. "Flora's been studying the new emergency checklists that came down from command. She's probably the most current on procedures of anyone in the unit." It was a small kindness, but Flora appreciated the support. The briefing continued with discussions of weather patterns, communication protocols, and cargo handling procedures. Flora took detailed notes, though she'd already memorized most of the information. Her meticulous preparation had become a defense mechanism against the constant questioning of her capabilities. If she couldn't match her colleagues' physical strength, she could at least exceed their theoretical knowledge. As the meeting concluded, Flora gathered her materials and headed toward the aircraft. The massive C-130 sat on the tarmac like a patient beast, its cargo ramp lowered to accommodate the morning's loading operations. Ground crews moved efficiently around the aircraft, securing pallets of medical supplies and communication equipment. The familiar smell of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid filled the air, a scent that had become as comforting to Flora as her grandmother's kitchen. She climbed aboard through the crew entrance, immediately beginning her pre-flight systems check. The C-130's flight engineer station was a marvel of 1950s engineering. Dozens of gauges, switches, and indicators arranged in logical groups across 3 main panels. To untrained eyes, it looked overwhelmingly complex. To Flora, it was a familiar symphony of information, each gauge and indicator telling part of the aircraft's story. Sergeant Martinez, one of the loadmasters, approached her station with a clipboard full of cargo documentation. "Morning, Garcia. We're carrying some heavy medical equipment today, centrifuges, X-ray machines, that sort of thing. Total cargo weight is pushing our limits." Flora nodded, making notes on her fuel calculation worksheet. Heavy cargo meant higher fuel consumption, which meant more careful monitoring of engine parameters and fuel distribution. It also meant that any emergency landing would be more challenging, with additional weight affecting aircraft handling characteristics. As she worked through her checklists, Flora became aware of a conversation taking place near the cargo ramp. 2 ground crew supervisors were discussing crew assignments for upcoming missions, and her name had come up. "I heard they're considering Garcia for the Bosnia rotation next month," one was saying. "Medical supply runs into some pretty challenging airfields." "Really?" the other replied, his tone skeptical. "Those mountain strips can be tricky. Limited runway length, crosswinds, and if you have mechanical problems." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. "Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Nice girl, smart as hell, but some of those emergency procedures require real muscle. If you're coming into Sarajevo with hydraulic failure and strong crosswinds." Again, the unfinished sentence spoke volumes. Flora continued her pre-flight checks, her hands moving automatically through familiar procedures while her mind processed the conversation. The Bosnia rotation was exactly the kind of mission she'd been hoping for: challenging flights to steer airfields, delivering critical medical supplies to areas where her technical expertise could make a real difference. But once again, her physical limitations were being weighed against her qualifications. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd scored highest in her class on aircraft systems knowledge. She could troubleshoot complex mechanical problems that left seasoned engineers scratching their heads. But when it came to cranking the manual valve or operating emergency controls, her slight build became a liability that overshadowed everything else. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Major Hoffman appeared at her station, clipboard in hand for the final crew briefing. "Garcia, I need you to be particularly vigilant on hydraulic system monitoring today. We're carrying maximum cargo weight, which puts additional stress on all aircraft systems." "Understood, sir," Flora replied. "I'll maintain continuous monitoring of hydraulic pressure and temperature across all 3 systems." Hoffman studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "And if we encounter any emergencies requiring manual reversion?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Flora met his gaze steadily. "I'm fully qualified on all emergency procedures, sir. I'll execute them according to established protocols." It was the right answer, technically correct and professionally delivered. But both of them knew that qualifications and capability weren't always the same thing. Hoffman nodded curtly and moved on to brief the pilots, leaving Flora alone with her gauges and her doubts. As the engines began their startup sequence, filling the aircraft with the familiar whine of turboprops coming to life, Flora ran through one final mental rehearsal of emergency procedures. She'd practiced them countless times in simulators and training scenarios, but the nagging doubt remained. In a real emergency, when lives depended on her ability to physically operate heavy manual controls, would her knowledge be enough to overcome her limitations? The aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, and Flora focused on her instrument panels, monitoring engine parameters and system status. Outside the small crew windows, she could see the German countryside rolling past, peaceful and serene under the morning sun. It was going to be a beautiful day for flying. She had no idea that before. It was over. She'd discover that strength had nothing to do with the size of your arms, and everything to do with the size of your heart. While her crewmates spent their off-duty hours at the base recreation center or the local German pubs, Flora Garcia could be found in places most people avoided: the aircraft maintenance hangar at 2,300 hours, the base library's technical section, and the flight simulator room during her supposed rest periods. What her colleagues didn't know was that Flora had been preparing for scenarios they couldn't even imagine. Every evening after completing her official duties, Flora made her way to Hangar 7, where decommissioned aircraft served as training platforms. Under the dim fluorescent lights, she practiced emergency procedures on retired C-130s that had been converted for instructional use. But unlike the standard training regimen, Flora had developed her own specialized approach to overcoming her physical limitations. She discovered that leverage was more important than raw strength. By adjusting her body position and using fulcrum points that larger engineers ignored, she could generate surprising amounts of torque on manual controls. While other crew members relied on brute force to turn emergency valve wheels, Flora had learned to use precise technique, timing, and mechanical advantage. She practiced these movements hundreds of times, developing muscle memory that compensated for what she lacked in size. Her most ambitious project was a detailed study she'd undertaken of every C-130 emergency scenario recorded in the past decade. Flora had requested access to incident reports from air forces across NATO, studying not just the official outcomes, but the minute-by-minute decisions that had determined success or failure. She compiled this information into a personal database, cross-referencing aircraft configurations, weather conditions, crew responses, and equipment failures. Late one night in the technical library, Sergeant Alina Kozlov, a Russian exchange officer, discovered Flora hunched over a stack of hydraulic system manuals that reached nearly to her chin. The books were open to detailed schematics of backup control systems, covered with Flora's handwritten notes and calculations. "Garcia, what are you doing here at midnight?" Kozlov asked, genuinely curious rather than critical. Flora looked up, slightly embarrassed to be caught in her private study session. "Just reviewing some emergency procedures. I want to make sure I understand all the manual reversion systems completely." Kozlov examined the open manuals, noting the complexity of the material Flora was studying. These weren't basic flight engineer texts, but advanced technical manuals used by aircraft designers and systems engineers. "This is graduate-level aerospace engineering material. Why are you studying hydraulic control theory at this level?" "If I understand exactly how the systems work at a fundamental level, I can troubleshoot problems more efficiently," Flora explained. "When hydraulic pressure fails, it's not just about turning valves. It's about understanding pressure differentials, mechanical advantage, and system interdependencies." What Flora didn't mention was her growing collection of specialized tools and techniques. She'd acquired a set of torque multipliers, mechanical devices that could increase her effective strength when operating manual controls. She'd studied ergonomic positioning techniques used by smaller technicians in civilian aviation. Most importantly, she developed a comprehensive understanding of how to prioritize emergency actions when physical limitations meant she couldn't do everything at once. Her simulator sessions were equally intensive. Flora had convinced the training supervisor to allow her after-hours access to the C-130 flight simulator, ostensibly for routine systems review. In reality, she was running herself through increasingly complex emergency scenarios, focusing specifically on situations where manual reversion would be required. That the simulator's computer could generate failures that most pilots never experienced. In real life, complete hydraulic system loss, multiple engine failures, structural damage affecting control surfaces. Flora practiced these scenarios until she could execute emergency procedures smoothly, even under extreme stress. She timed herself on every action, looking for ways to compensate for her physical limitations through superior preparation and technique. One particular scenario haunted her practice sessions: total hydraulic failure during heavy cargo operations. The C-130's manual reversion system required significant physical effort to control the aircraft, but Flora had discovered that the key wasn't sustained strength, it was endurance and technique. By using proper body mechanics and pacing herself, she could maintain control for much longer periods than anyone expected. Her most closely guarded secret was a physical training regimen she'd developed specifically for flight engineering duties. While her colleagues focused on general fitness, Flora had consulted with sports physiologists to develop exercises that would maximize her functional strength for aviation emergencies. Grip strength training, core stability work, and endurance exercises that specifically targeted the muscle groups used in manual aircraft control. She practiced on specialized equipment she'd acquired through medical supply context devices, used for physical therapy that could simulate the resistance and motion patterns of aircraft emergency controls. Her small apartment near the base had been converted into a training facility that would have impressed professional athletes. The most remarkable aspect of Flora's preparation was her psychological training. She'd studied stress response patterns and developed mental techniques for maintaining clarity during extreme situations. Through meditation, visualization, and controlled stress exposure, she'd trained herself to remain calm and focused when others might panic. Flora's dedication went beyond personal improvement. She was preparing to prove that capability couldn't be measured by appearance. Every night spent studying, every hour in the simulator, every repetition of emergency procedures was building toward a moment she hoped would never come, but knew she had to be ready for. When Sergeant Kozlov encountered Flora in the library that night, she was witnessing just the tip of an iceberg of preparation that ran far deeper than anyone imagined. Flora had transformed herself from a questioned crew member into someone ready for challenges that hadn't even been conceived yet. The first signs of trouble appeared during a routine training evaluation 3 weeks after Flora's intense study period. Captain Mitchell had recommended Flora for advanced systems training, a program that would qualify her for complex international missions. The recommendation should have been routine given Flora's technical scores, but it sparked conversations that quickly spread through the base like ripples in a pond. "Garcia's spending an awful lot of time in the simulator," commented Staff Sergeant Weber during the maintenance briefing. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried an undercurrent of suspicion. "Night shifts, weekend sessions. Makes you wonder what she's trying to prove." The comment reached Sergeant Martinez, who'd noticed Flora's late-night study sessions in the technical library. "Yeah, I've seen her there too. Reading manuals that are way beyond normal flight engineer requirements. Advanced hydraulic theory, structural engineering texts. Seems like she's trying to do everyone else's job." These observations might have remained harmless workplace gossip, but they coincided with a broader discussion about crew assignments for high-risk missions. The European Air Transport Wing was preparing for increased operations in challenging environments, and crew selection had become more scrutinized than ever. Major Hoffman found himself fielding questions about Flora's qualifications during a commander's meeting. "Sir," asked Captain Reynolds from the 52nd Squadron, "I've heard Garcia is being considered for the Balkan rotation. Those mountain airfields can be unforgiving. Are you confident in her emergency response capabilities?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Hoffman's hesitation spoke volumes. "Garcia is technically proficient," he replied carefully. "Her systems knowledge is exceptional." "That's not really what I'm asking," Reynolds pressed. If she's flying into Sarajevo with a full cargo load and loses hydraulics on approach, can she physically handle the manual controls? Word of this exchange filtered back to the enlisted personnel through the efficient military gossip network. Suddenly, Flora's dedication to preparation was being reinterpreted as compensation for inadequacy. Her simulator time became evidence of uncertainty rather than thoroughness. Her technical study was seen as avoiding rather than enhancing her core responsibilities. The shift in perception became apparent during routine crew interactions. When Flora offered technical insights during briefings, she noticed colleagues exchanging glances. Her suggestions, once valued for their accuracy, were now met with polite but dismissive responses. "Thanks, Garcia, but I think we'll stick with standard procedures," became a common refrain. The most damaging whispers centered on her physical training regimen. Sergeant Williams from the fitness center had noticed Flora's unusual workout schedule and mentioned it to other staff. "Garcia's in here at weird hours, doing strange exercises I've never seen before. Almost like she's trying to build strength for something specific." This observation reached the wrong ears. Soon, Flora's specialized training was being described as evidence that she knew she was inadequate for her role. If she has to train that hard just to do basic flight engineer duties, someone remarked, maybe she's not cut out for this job. The whispers intensified when Flora requested access to additional technical manuals from the base library. Librarian Sarah Chun, trying to be helpful, mentioned to her supervisor that the young Spanish engineer was checking out materials far beyond her apparent needs. She's studying aircraft structural design, advanced control system theory, even some materials on emergency landing techniques that are really more relevant to pilots. This information reached the training squadron, where it was interpreted as Flora attempting to exceed her authority. Chief Master Sergeant Thompson, responsible for training oversight, began to question whether Flora understood her role boundaries. "Flight engineers need to focus on their specific duties," he commented to his staff. When someone starts studying outside their specialty, it can indicate unclear priorities. The most serious concern emerged from an unexpected source, the Flight Safety Office. A safety officer reviewing training records noticed Flora's extensive simulator time and began asking questions about her motivation. "Excessive training can sometimes indicate anxiety about job performance," the officer noted in a report. "Personnel who lack confidence in their abilities often overprepare as a psychological compensation mechanism." Flora began to sense the change in atmosphere during routine interactions. Conversations that had once included her naturally now seemed to pause when she approached. Her technical contributions during briefings were acknowledged but not engaged with. Most painfully, she noticed that crew members were beginning to work around her, rather than with her during complex procedures. The breaking point came during a crew resource management seminar. These sessions were designed to improve communication and teamwork among aircrew members. During a scenario exercise, Flora suggested a technical solution to a simulated hydraulic problem. Her answer was correct and innovative, but the instructor's response was telling. "That's an interesting approach, Garcia," the instructor said. "But in emergency situations, we generally prefer solutions that don't require specialized knowledge or techniques that other crew members might not understand." The message was clear. Flora's expertise was becoming viewed as a liability rather than an asset. Her preparation and knowledge were making others uncomfortable, suggesting that she was either showing off or compensating for fundamental inadequacies. After the seminar, Flora overheard a conversation between two pilots that crystallized her growing isolation. "Garcia's obviously smart," one was saying, "but all that extra studying makes me nervous. Either she doesn't trust standard training, or she knows something about her limitations that we don't." "Yeah," the other replied. "In a real emergency, I want crew members who are confident in their basic training. not someone who's constantly second-guessing procedures. Flora walked away from that conversation with a heavy heart. Her dedication to excellence was being interpreted as evidence of weakness. Her preparation for challenges was being seen as admission of inadequacy. The very qualities that made her a better flight engineer were turning her colleagues against her. That night, alone in her apartment, Flora stared at her wall of technical manuals and training equipment. She could give up her extra preparation, conform to expectations, and accept the limitations others placed on her. Or she could continue preparing for a moment that might never come, a moment when all her hidden strengths would finally matter more than others' perceptions. She chose to continue preparing, even as the whispers grew louder and the isolation deepened. The summons to Major Hoffman's office came on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. Flora received the message during her pre-flight checks for what should have been a routine cargo run to Greece. The formality of the written order, report, to the squadron commander's office at 1400 hours for performance review, sent a chill down her spine. Flora spent her lunch break walking the perimeter of the base, trying to prepare mentally for whatever was coming. The German countryside stretched endlessly beyond the fence line, peaceful fields and scattered farmhouses that seemed to mock the turmoil building in her chest. She'd known this confrontation was inevitable ever since the whispers had started. But knowing hadn't made it any easier to face at precisely 1400 hours. Flora knocked on Major Hoffman's office door. His gravelly voice called her inside, where she found herself facing not just her commanding officer, but Chief Master Sergeant Thompson from the training squadron and Captain Phillips from flight operations. The presence of multiple senior personnel transformed what she'd hoped might be a routine discussion into something far more serious. Specialist Garcia, Major Hoffman began, his weathered face displaying the neutral expression he wore for difficult conversations. Please take a seat. We need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding your focus and priorities. Flora settled into the chair across from Hoffman's desk, her back straight and hands folded in her lap. The office felt smaller than usual, crowded with authority figures and unspoken accusations. Through the window behind Hoffman, she could see C-130s conducting routine operations on the flight line, aircraft she might no longer be qualified to crew if this meeting went poorly. Chief Thompson consulted a folder thick with documentation. Garcia, your technical knowledge is exceptional, and your attention to detail is beyond question. However, several supervisors have expressed concerns about what appears to be excessive focus on duties and scenarios outside your assigned responsibilities. Sir, I'm not sure I understand, Flora replied, though she understood perfectly. Could you be more specific about these concerns? Captain Phillips leaned forward, his tone carrying the weight of someone who'd made an uncomfortable decision. You've been spending significant time in simulators running emergency scenarios that exceed normal training requirements. You've requested access to technical manuals far beyond standard flight engineer materials. Multiple personnel have reported observing you conducting what appears to be specialized physical training related to aircraft operations. The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a crash fire. Flora felt her career balance on the edge. Of these men's perceptions, reduced to a series of observations that painted her dedication as suspicious behavior. Sir, I believe in being prepared for any situation we might encounter, Flora said carefully. My additional study and training have made me more effective at my assigned duties, not distracted from them. Major Hoffman's expression remained neutral, but Flora caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested disappointment. Garcia, I appreciate dedication to duty, but when that dedication becomes obsessive focus on scenarios and procedures outside your area of responsibility, it raises questions about your confidence in your core competencies. The words hit Flora like a physical blow. Her preparation was being interpreted as evidence of insecurity rather than excellence. Chief Thompson added his perspective, the bluntness that senior enlisted personnel were known for. Garcia, you're a flight engineer. Your job is to monitor aircraft systems, manage fuel consumption, and coordinate with ground personnel. When you start studying advanced hydraulic theory and practicing emergency procedures that are primarily pilot responsibilities, it suggests you either don't understand your role or don't trust your basic training. Flora felt anger building in her chest, but forced her voice to remain steady. Chief, understanding how systems work at a fundamental level makes me better at troubleshooting problems. And emergency procedures are everyone's responsibility when lives are at stake. That's exactly the attitude we're concerned about, Captain Phillips interjected. Military aviation works because everyone focuses on their specific area of expertise. When crew members start trying to exceed their assigned roles, it can create confusion and undermine crew coordination. Major Hoffman pulled out what Flora recognized as her training records and performance evaluations. Garcia, your simulator time has increased by 300% over the past 6 months. Your library requests include materials used by aircraft designers and test pilots. You've been observed conducting physical training that appears specifically designed to compensate for perceived limitations in strength requirements. The last observation stung most deeply because it was accurate. Flora had been training to overcome her physical limitations, but hearing it described as compensation for perceived limitations made it sound like admission of inadequacy rather than professional development. Sir, Flora said, her voice growing firmer despite the formal setting, I've never failed to meet any performance standard. My technical evaluations have been consistently excellent. My dedication to additional training should be seen as an asset, not a liability. Chief Thompson's response was swift and uncompromising. Your technical scores aren't in question, Garcia. Your judgment is. When someone feels the need to prepare for scenarios far beyond their normal duties, it suggests they lack confidence in their ability to handle routine responsibilities. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of aircraft engines on the flight line. Flora realized that everything she'd done to make herself a better flight engineer was being used as evidence against her. Her preparation was proof of inadequacy, her dedication evidence of poor priorities, her expertise a sign of role confusion. Major Hoffman delivered the verdict with the clinical precision of a medical diagnosis. Garcia, effective immediately. You're restricted to standard training protocols. No more unauthorized simulator time, no more requests for advanced technical materials, and no more specialized training activities. You'll focus exclusively on your assigned flight engineer duties and standard emergency procedures. Flora felt something cold settle in her stomach. They weren't just limiting her training, they were telling her to be less than she could be. Sir, what if situations arise that require the knowledge and skills I've developed? Those situations are the responsibility of other crew members with appropriate training and authority, Hoffman replied. Your job is to excel within your assigned role, not to prepare for roles you're not qualified for. As Flora left the office, she understood that she'd been given a choice: accept their limitations or risk her career. She could conform to their narrow definition of her capabilities, or continue preparing for challenges they couldn't imagine, and face the consequences of their disapproval. Walking across the base toward her quarters, Flora made her decision. She would continue preparing, but more carefully, more quietly. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, she sensed that the moment when her hidden strengths would matter was coming closer. That evening, Flora sat in her small apartment staring at the wall of technical manuals and training equipment that had become the center of her life. The confrontation with Major Hoffman had left her emotionally drained, caught between the desire to prove herself and the very real threat to her military career. The choice before her seemed simple on the surface: conform to expectations and keep her job, or continue her unauthorized preparation and risk everything. She picked up the phone to call her father back in Valencia, needing to hear a familiar voice in a world that suddenly felt hostile and uncertain. Miguel Garcia answered on the second ring, his warm Spanish accent immediately transporting Flora back to childhood evenings in his aircraft maintenance shop. "Mia, you sound troubled," he said after hearing the strain in her voice. "What's happening in Germany?" Flora found herself pouring out the entire story, the whispers, the confrontation, the impossible choice between being who she was and who others wanted her to be. Miguel listened without interruption, the way he had when she was young and facing schoolyard bullies who said girls couldn't understand aircraft engines. "Do you remember," Miguel said when she finished, "what I told you when you were 8 years old and the other children said you were too small to help me with the helicopter maintenance?" Flora smiled despite her distress. "You said that aircraft don't care how big you are. They only care whether you understand them and treat them with respect. And what else did I say? That the best mechanics aren't the strongest ones, but the ones who prepare for problems before they happen." The memory brought both comfort and renewed uncertainty. Her father's wisdom had guided her this far, but it had also led to her current predicament. "Mia," Miguel continued, "you called me because you already know what you must do. The question isn't whether to continue preparing, it's how to do it without letting others' fears stop you." After ending the call, Flora walked to her bathroom mirror and studied her reflection. At 24, she still looked younger than her years, her slight build and gentle features, reinforcing everyone's perception that she was too delicate for the demands of military aviation. But behind her dark eyes was a determination that few people had bothered to recognize. She returned to her training materials and began making difficult decisions. The obvious equipment, torque multipliers, specialized training aids, advanced technical manuals would have to be hidden more carefully. Her simulator sessions would become less frequent, but more focused. Her physical training would shift to her apartment and off-base facilities where military personnel wouldn't observe her unusual regimen. Flora developed a new strategy for her preparation. Instead of the obvious studying that had attracted attention, she would integrate advanced learning into routine activities. She memorized complex procedures during mandatory briefings, practiced mental calculations during boring administrative duties, and used official maintenance time to study aircraft systems more deeply than required. Her most important decision was to create multiple backup plans for every conceivable emergency scenario. If she couldn't openly prepare for complex situations, she would develop mental frameworks that would allow her to improvise effectively under pressure. She studied patterns in aircraft failures, memorized optimal responses to system combinations, and developed decision trees that would guide her actions even in unprecedented situations. The psychological challenge was more difficult than the practical one. Flora had to maintain her professional demeanor while knowing that colleagues viewed her preparation as evidence of inadequacy. She had to smile and nod when supervisors reminded her to focus on her assigned duties, all while continuing the very activities they'd forbidden. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Flora received an unexpected visitor. Sergeant Alina Kozlov, the Russian exchange officer who discovered her late-night studying, appeared at her apartment door with a bottle of wine and a knowing smile. "I heard about your meeting with Major Hoffman," Alina said as Flora let her inside. "I also heard about the new restrictions on your training activities." Flora tensed, unsure whether this visit represented support or additional scrutiny. Elena noticed her discomfort and laughed. "Relax, Garcia. I'm not here to report on your activities. I'm here because I think what they're doing to you is wrong." Over the next hour, Elena shared her own experiences with military bureaucracy that valued conformity over excellence. As a Russian officer in NATO exercises, she'd faced constant questions about her loyalty and competence, forced to prove herself repeatedly while less qualified colleagues were given opportunities she was denied. "The irony," Alina observed. Is that your command is so worried about you exceeding your authority that they can't see you're preparing to excel within it. They're punishing you for being too good at your job. Elena's visit provided Flora with something she hadn't realized she'd been missing: validation from someone who understood the pressure of being judged by appearance rather than capability. More importantly, Elena offered practical support for continuing her preparation without detection. "I have access to training facilities at the International Cooperation Center," Elena explained. "NATO exchange officers use them for cross-training exercises. If you're interested in continuing your simulator work, I can arrange access through official channels that won't raise questions with your command." Flora accepted the offer gratefully, recognizing it as both an opportunity and a test of her commitment. If she took advantage of Elena's assistance, she would be crossing another line, using foreign military resources to continue activities her own command had forbidden. But if she declined, she would be abandoning the preparation that might someday save lives. That night, Flora made her final decision about the path forward. She would continue preparing more carefully and with help from unexpected allies, because she'd realized something important during her weeks of isolation and criticism. Her dedication to excellence wasn't a character flaw to be corrected, but a strength to be protected. She pulled out her hidden training materials and resumed her studies, knowing that each page turned and each procedure memorized brought her closer to a moment that might never come, or might come tomorrow. Either way, she would be ready, regardless of what others thought she was capable of achieving. The choice was made. Flora Garcia would continue becoming the flight engineer she knew she could be, even if it meant doing so in the shadows. Flight 847 lifted off from Ramstein Air Base at 0847 on what promised to be a perfect flying day. The morning sun painted the German countryside in brilliant gold, and weather reports showed clear skies across the entire Mediterranean route. Flora settled into her flight engineer station as the massive C-130 climbed steadily toward its cruising altitude of 28,000 feet. Monitoring the familiar symphony of engine parameters and system indicators, the aircraft was carrying its maximum cargo load: 42,000 pounds of critical medical equipment destined for hospitals across southern Europe. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, and emergency medical supplies filled the cargo bay, representing millions of dollars in life-saving technology. The weight pushed the Hercules to its operational limits, but all systems showed green as they leveled off and turned southeast toward their first destination in Naples. For the first 3 hours, the flight proceeded with textbook precision. Flora monitored fuel consumption, tracked engine performance, and coordinated with air traffic control for their planned stops. Major Hoffman and Captain Mitchell handled the aircraft with their usual professional competence, while the loadmasters in the cargo bay ensured their precious medical cargo remained secured at 11:47 hours. Flying over the azure waters of the Mediterranean at 28,000 feet, everything changed in an instant. Flora was reviewing fuel calculations when she noticed an anomaly in hydraulic system number 2. The pressure reading dropped slightly, then recovered, then dropped again. She leaned forward, studying the gauge more closely. Hydraulic systems were the lifeblood of the C-130, providing power for flight controls, landing gear, and cargo handling equipment. "Sir," she called to Major Hoffman over the intercom, "I'm seeing some irregularity in hydraulic system 2. Pressure is fluctuating between normal and low." Hoffman acknowledged the report calmly. Hydraulic fluctuations weren't uncommon in older aircraft, and the C-130 had 3 independent hydraulic systems for redundancy. "Keep monitoring it, Garcia. Let me know if it gets worse." But it did get worse rapidly. Within 10 minutes, hydraulic system 2 pressure dropped to 0 and stayed there. Flora's training kicked in as she began isolating the failed system and checking the status of the 2 remaining hydraulic systems. This was manageable. The aircraft could operate safely on 2 hydraulic systems. Then, at 12:03 hours, hydraulic system 1 began showing pressure loss. Flora's heart rate increased as she watched the pressure gauge drop steadily. This wasn't a gradual failure like system 2. Something catastrophic was happening. She began emergency procedures, trying to isolate the leak and preserve what pressure remained. "Sir, we've lost hydraulic system 1 as well. Pressure is dropping rapidly across the entire system." The concern in Hoffman's voice was immediately apparent. "Garcia, give me a full system status. What do we have left?" Flora's hands moved quickly across her panels, checking every hydraulic system indicator and backup system status. What she found made her blood run cold. "Sir, we have hydraulic system 3 at normal pressure, but I'm seeing indications that suggest we may have a common mode failure. If system 3 fails, we'll lose all hydraulic power." The implications hung in the air like a death sentence. Without hydraulic power, the C-130's flight controls would become manually operated, requiring enormous physical strength to control the aircraft. Landing gear operation would require manual extension using hand cranks. Most critically, with maximum cargo weight, the aircraft would be extremely difficult to control manually. At 12:07 hours, their worst fears were realized. Hydraulic system 3 pressure began dropping rapidly, and despite Flora's desperate attempts to isolate the failure, they lost all hydraulic power within 2 minutes. "We have complete hydraulic failure," Flora announced, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "All 3 systems are offline. We're going to manual reversion across all flight controls." Major Hoffman immediately declared an emergency and began coordinating with air traffic control for priority handling. Captain Mitchell started configuring the aircraft for manual control, a process that required both pilots to use maximum physical effort to maintain level flight. In the cargo bay, the loadmasters began securing equipment for potential emergency landing, but the real challenge was just beginning. The C-130's manual reversion system required continuous physical input to maintain control. With maximum cargo weight, the control forces were enormous, far beyond what most pilots could sustain for more than a few minutes. They were 400 miles from the nearest suitable airport, with at least 90 minutes of flying time ahead of them. Hoffman's arms were already trembling from the effort of controlling the aircraft manually. "Garcia, we need to start dumping cargo to reduce weight and prepare for manual gear extension when we get closer to landing." Flora began coordinating cargo dumping procedures, but her mind was racing ahead to the real problem. Manual gear extension on a fully loaded C-130 required someone to turn heavy hand cranks for extended periods, exactly the kind of physical demand that everyone assumed she couldn't handle. As she watched Hoffman and Mitchell struggling to control the aircraft, Flora realized that the moment she'd been secretly preparing for had arrived. All her hidden training, all her specialized techniques for overcoming physical limitations, all the knowledge she'd accumulated despite official disapproval, everything was about to be tested in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly below them, beautiful and indifferent to their crisis. In 90 minutes, they would attempt an emergency landing that would require every skill Flora had developed in secret. The question wasn't whether she was strong enough. It was whether her preparation had been thorough enough to overcome limitations that everyone, including herself, had always assumed were insurmountable. The aircraft shuddered as Hoffman fought to maintain control. Flora took a deep breath and began preparing for the most challenging hour and a half of her life. As the C-130 flew over the Mediterranean with complete hydraulic failure, the crew's immediate concern was determining their best course of action. Major Hoffman was already struggling with the manual flight controls, his arms straining against the enormous forces required to keep the heavily loaded aircraft level. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool cabin temperature. "Garcia, give me our options for emergency landing sites," Hoffman commanded through gritted teeth. The physical effort of controlling the aircraft manually was already taking its toll, and they had over an hour of flying time remaining. Flora had anticipated this moment during countless hours of secret preparation. She pulled up navigation charts and began calculating distances to suitable airfields. "Sir, we have 3 primary options. Naples is closest at 380 nautical miles, but the approach is over mountainous terrain. Palermo offers better approach. Paths at 420 miles. Our best option might be Barcelona. It's 450 miles, but they have the longest runway and best emergency response capabilities." Captain Mitchell looked back from the co-pilot's seat, her face pale with exertion. "With this cargo weight and no hydraulic assistance, we're going to need every foot of runway we can get. Barcelona sounds right, but can we maintain control for that long?" The question hung in the air because everyone knew the answer. Manual control of a fully loaded C-130 required sustained physical effort that few pilots could maintain for more than 20 or 30 minutes. They were looking at nearly 2 hours of constant struggle against massive control forces. Hoffman made the decision with characteristic military decisiveness. "Set course for Barcelona. Garcia, start preparing for manual gear extension and configure the aircraft for emergency landing procedures." This was the moment Flora had been dreading and preparing for simultaneously. Manual gear extension on the C-130 required operating heavy hand cranks located in the cargo bay. The main landing gear required 52 complete turns of a crank that, under full cargo load, would demand considerable sustained strength. The nose gear needed an additional 28 turns of a separate crank system. "Sir," Flora said carefully, "I'm ready to perform manual gear extension when we reach the appropriate altitude." Hoffman glanced back at her, his expression troubled. Even under the stress of the emergency, he was clearly thinking about Flora's physical limitations. "Garcia, those manual gear cranks are going to be extremely difficult to operate with our current weight. The forces involved ... He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. The manual gear extension system had been designed in an era when flight engineers were typically larger men with considerable upper body strength. The hand cranks required not just strength, but sustained endurance to complete the dozens of turns necessary for full gear extension. Sergeant Martinez, one of the loadmasters, moved forward from the cargo bay. "Sir, if you need help with the gear extension, I can assist Garcia. I've got experience with the manual systems." The offer was well-intentioned, but Flora recognized it for what it was: an assumption that she would need help because she lacked the physical capability to handle the job alone. More concerning was the implication that in a cockpit already struggling with manual flight controls, they could spare another crew member to assist with her duties. Captain Mitchell voiced the concern that everyone was thinking. "Major, with respect to Garcia's technical knowledge, those gear cranks are going to require significant physical strength. If we can't get the gear down properly, we're looking at a gear-up landing with 42,000 pounds of medical equipment." Flora felt the familiar sting of doubt about her capabilities, but this time the stakes were life and death rather than just career advancement. "Sir, I'm confident in my ability to perform manual gear extension according to established procedures." Chief Loadmaster Williams joined the conversation from his position near the cargo bay. "Garcia, no offense, but I've operated those cranks during maintenance procedures. They're tough even when the aircraft is empty. With our current cargo load, the gear struts are compressed under maximum weight. You're looking at forces that would challenge anyone." The doubt in the cabin was palpable. Flora could see it in their faces, the same concern that had followed her throughout her career, magnified by the extreme circumstances. Even in an emergency, her colleagues were more worried about her physical limitations than confident in her abilities. Major Hoffman made what he believed was a reasonable decision under the circumstances. Garcia, I want you to focus on engine management and system monitoring. Martinez, you'll handle the manual gear extension when we get closer to Barcelona. Williams, you'll assist him. The words hit Flora like a physical blow. In the most critical moment of her career, she was being relegated to monitoring gauges while others performed the emergency procedures she had trained for obsessively. Her expertise in manual systems, her secret preparation for exactly this scenario, all of it dismissed because of assumptions about her physical capability. Sir, Flora said, trying to keep her voice steady, I'm fully qualified on manual gear extension procedures. I've trained extensively on these systems. Hoffman's response was not unkind, but it was final. Garcia, I need you focused on engine parameters and system monitoring. If we lose engine power on top of hydraulic failure, we're in serious trouble. That's where your expertise is most valuable. Flora wanted to argue, to explain about her months of secret preparation, her specialized training techniques, her deep understanding of the gear extension system. But military protocol and emergency situations didn't allow for lengthy discussions about crew assignments. The aircraft commander's decision was final. As she returned to monitoring her engine gauges, Flora felt the weight of 2 years of being underestimated crushing down on her. Even in a crisis where her preparation could save lives, she was still seen as too weak, too small, too limited to handle the physical demands of her job. But as the aircraft continued its labored flight toward Barcelona, Flora began to realize something that her colleagues hadn't considered. Emergencies rarely follow predicted patterns, and the crew assignments that made sense now might not make sense when the real challenges began. She continued monitoring her systems while quietly reviewing her mental preparation for manual gear extension, because somewhere deep in her training and intuition, she sensed that she might need those skills sooner than anyone expected. 45 minutes into their emergency flight toward Barcelona, the situation aboard Flight 847 deteriorated beyond anyone's worst projections. Major Hoffman and Captain Mitchell were both showing severe signs of physical exhaustion from fighting the manual flight controls. Their arms trembled continuously, and their coordination was beginning to suffer as fatigue set in. I can't maintain this much longer, Mitchell gasped, sweat streaming down her face despite the cool cabin temperature. The control forces are too high. I'm losing effective input. Flora watched from her engineering station as both pilots struggled with the basic task of keeping the aircraft level. The C-130 was wallowing through the sky like a wounded whale, occasionally dropping or climbing unexpectedly as the pilot's strength fluctuated. At their current rate of physical deterioration, they would be unable to control the aircraft effectively long before reaching Barcelona. Hoffman made a decision that revealed the desperation of their situation. Garcia, I need you to take Mitchell's position on the co-pilot controls. Martinez, you move up to flight engineer station to monitor engines. Flora's heart raced. This was completely outside standard emergency procedures. Flight engineers weren't trained to operate primary flight controls, and Martinez had minimal experience with engine management systems. But desperation was forcing Hoffman to improvise with whatever resources he had available. Sir, Flora said carefully, I don't have pilot training on primary flight controls, but I do have extensive knowledge of the manual reversion systems. Maybe I should— Garcia, Hoffman interrupted, his voice strained with effort. I need you on controls now. We'll figure out the gear extension when we get closer to Barcelona. Flora moved to the co-pilot's position and grasped the control yoke, immediately feeling the enormous forces fighting against her hands. The manual flight control system transmitted every aerodynamic load directly to the pilots, requiring constant physical input to maintain even basic flight parameters. Within minutes, her arms were burning with the effort, but something remarkable happened. Flora's months of specialized physical training, and her understanding of mechanical leverage began to pay dividends. While she couldn't match the raw strength of larger pilots, she could use technique and body positioning to maintain control more efficiently. Her smaller hands actually provided better grip on the controls, and her lower center of gravity gave her superior stability in the seat. After 20 minutes on the controls, Flora made a startling discovery. She was maintaining better aircraft control than either of the trained pilots had managed. Her technical understanding of how the control surfaces affected aircraft behavior allowed her to anticipate and correct deviations before they became severe. "Garcia," Hoffman said with surprise, "your control inputs are much more stable than ours were. How are you managing the workload?" Flora didn't have time to explain her secret preparation, but she realized this was her moment to prove that capability couldn't be measured by appearance. "Sir, I think I can maintain control for the remaining flight time. But we have a bigger problem. Martinez doesn't have the system's knowledge to manage engine parameters during an emergency approach." She was right. From her new position at the flight engineer station, Martinez was struggling with the complex calculations and system management that Flora performed instinctively. Engine temperatures were fluctuating, fuel distribution was becoming unbalanced, and critical system warnings were being missed. "Sir," Flora continued, "I recommend that Martinez return to his loadmaster duties, and I handle both flight controls and engine management. I can monitor both positions simultaneously." It was an unprecedented suggestion. No single crew member had ever attempted to manage both primary flight controls and complex engineering systems during an emergency. But conventional solutions weren't working, and Flora was demonstrating capabilities that none of them had expected. Hoffman made another desperate decision. "Martinez, return to cargo duties. Garcia, you have both flight controls and engine management. Can you handle both positions?" "Yes, sir," Flora replied with quiet confidence. What her colleagues didn't know was that she had practiced exactly this scenario during her secret simulator sessions. She had trained herself to divide attention between flight control inputs and system monitoring, developing the mental discipline to process multiple complex tasks simultaneously. As Martinez returned to the cargo bay, Flora began the most challenging hour of her career. With her left hand on the control yoke, she maintained aircraft stability while her right hand moved continuously across engine controls and system monitors. Her mind processed airspeed, altitude, engine parameters, fuel status, and system warnings. In a constant flow of technical analysis, the Mediterranean coast appeared on the horizon as they approached Spanish airspace. Barcelona approach control cleared them for a priority emergency approach, but Flora knew their most difficult challenge was still ahead: manual gear extension. "Sir," she called to Hoffman, "we need to configure for approach." "Should I begin?" "Manual gear extension procedures?" The question revealed the magnitude of their situation. Flora was successfully handling both flight controls and engineering duties, but manual gear extension would require her to leave the flight controls that had already proven too difficult for the trained pilots to manage effectively. Hoffman realized the impossible choice they faced. If Flora left the controls for gear extension, they might lose control of the aircraft. If someone else attempted the gear extension, they might not have the strength or technique to complete the procedure successfully. In that moment, Flora made a decision that would define her career and potentially save 47 lives. "Sir, I'm going to maintain flight controls and attempt gear extension simultaneously. I believe I can manage both tasks." It was the most audacious proposal anyone had ever made during an aircraft emergency. Flora was suggesting that she could fly a crippled aircraft manually while simultaneously operating the physically demanding gear extension system tasks that normally required multiple qualified personnel working together. Hoffman stared at her for a moment. recognizing that they had moved far beyond standard procedures into uncharted territory where survival depended entirely on individual capability and determination. "Garcia," he said quietly, "if you think you can do it, you have my authorization to try." With Barcelona's coastline visible through the cockpit windows, Flora began the most demanding technical challenge of her life. The manual gear extension procedure that everyone had assumed was beyond her physical capability now became her responsibility, while simultaneously maintaining manual flight control of a fully loaded aircraft that two experienced pilots had found impossible to manage. Flora's months of secret preparation were about to be tested in circumstances that exceeded even her most ambitious training scenarios. She had practiced gear extension techniques, studied optimal body positioning, and developed mechanical advantages that compensated for her size limitations. But she had never attempted these procedures, while also flying an aircraft under emergency conditions. The first challenge was positioning herself to operate the gear extension cranks while maintaining flight control inputs. The manual gear cranks were located behind the co-pilot's position, requiring her to twist in her seat and operate them with her right hand while her left hand remained on the control yoke. It was an awkward position that would test both her physical conditioning and her ability to divide attention between critical tasks. "Beginning manual main gear extension," Flora announced over the intercom, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. She reached back to grasp the main gear extension crank, immediately feeling the resistance that had concerned her colleagues. With the aircraft's full cargo load compressing the gear struts, the crank required significant force to initiate movement, but Flora's specialized training immediately proved its value. Instead of trying to muscle the crank through brute force, she used the leverage technique she had practiced for months. By positioning her body optimally and using a rhythmic motion that engaged her core strength rather than just her arms, she found she could generate surprising torque on the resistant mechanism. 1, 2, 3... Flora counted aloud as she turned the crank, simultaneously monitoring the aircraft's flight parameters with her peripheral vision. The control yoke in her left hand required constant small inputs to maintain level flight, while her right hand worked steadily on the gear extension crank. Major Hoffman watched in amazement as Flora managed both tasks with growing confidence. "Garcia, how many turns do you need for full main gear extension?" 52 turns for main gear, sir." "I'm at 15 turns now." Flora's breathing was controlled despite the physical effort. Her months of endurance training were allowing her to pace herself for the sustained effort ahead. The most remarkable aspect of Flora's performance was her ability to maintain aircraft control while operating the gear crank. Her left hand made constant small adjustments to the control yoke, keeping the aircraft stable and on course while her right hand worked rhythmically on the gear extension mechanism. It was a display of coordination and multitasking that impressed even the experienced pilots watching her. 25 turns, Flora called out, her voice still steady. Halfway through the main gear extension, she was proving that endurance and technique could overcome raw strength. The gear extension crank continued to turn steadily under her persistent effort, each rotation bringing them closer to a successful emergency landing. Barcelona Approach Control provided vectors for their emergency approach, and Flora acknowledged the clearances while continuing her gear extension work. 35 turns completed, switching to nose gear extension in approximately 10 minutes. Captain Mitchell, who had initially doubted Flora's physical capability, found herself studying Flora's technique with professional admiration. "Garcia, how are you maintaining such consistent control inputs while operating the gear crank?" Flora smiled slightly as she completed turn 42. "Practice, ma'am, and understanding that efficient technique beats raw strength every time." It was the closest she came to revealing the secret preparation that was making this performance possible. As Flora reached turn 52 on the main gear extension, She felt the mechanical resistance suddenly decrease, indicating that the gear had reached its fully extended position. "Main gear extension complete," she announced. "Beginning nose gear extension procedure." The nose gear extension presented a different challenge. The crank was located even further behind her position, requiring her to reach back and operate. It had an awkward angle while maintaining flight control. But Flora's flexibility and her understanding of optimal body mechanics allowed her to adapt quickly to the new position. Beginning nose gear extension, 28 turns required. Flora's right hand found the nose gear crank and began the steady rhythm she had established. Her left hand continued its constant small movements on the control yoke, keeping the aircraft stable as they descended toward Barcelona's emergency runway. Major Hoffman coordinated with air traffic control for their final approach clearance, but his attention was divided between navigation duties and amazement at Flora's performance. In 40 years of flying, he had never seen a single crew member successfully manage both flight controls and manual gear extension simultaneously. 10 turns completed on nose gear, Flora reported. Her breathing was slightly heavier now, but her voice remained strong and confident. The sustained physical effort was challenging, but it was well within the limits of her specialized conditioning. Barcelona's runway appeared ahead of them, emergency vehicles already positioning themselves for their arrival. Flora had 25 more minutes to complete the nose gear extension and configure the aircraft for landing, a timeline that would test every aspect of her preparation and determination. As she continued the steady rhythm of gear extension while maintaining precise flight control, Flora realized that all her secret training, all her hidden preparation, all her determination to prove that size didn't determine capability, was finally being vindicated in the most dramatic circumstances imaginable. The challenge was far from over, but Flora Garcia was proving that the strongest arms weren't always the biggest ones. Sometimes they were the most determined ones. The investigation into Flight 847's emergency landing began within hours of their arrival in Barcelona, but the conclusions were evident from the moment Flora Garcia guided the crippled C-130 safely onto the runway. What aviation experts initially dismissed as impossible had been accomplished by a 5'4" flight engineer whose colleagues had nicknamed her Noodle Arms. Dr. Sarah Chun, a human factors specialist from the European Aviation Safety Agency, arrived in Barcelona the following morning to investigate how a single crew member had successfully performed tasks that typically required multiple qualified personnel. Her preliminary findings revolutionized thinking about physical requirements in aviation emergencies. Specialist Garcia's performance demonstrates that we've been measuring the wrong variables, Dr. Chun reported to the investigation board. We focused on raw strength when we should have been evaluating endurance, technique, and mental resilience. Her ability to maintain precision control for over 2 hours while simultaneously completing manual gear extension represents a paradigm shift in our understanding of crew capabilities. The medical evaluation of Flora's physical condition after the landing provided equally surprising insights. Despite her obvious exhaustion, medical personnel found that her vital signs remained stable and her cognitive function was unimpaired. Her months of specialized conditioning had prepared her body for exactly the type of sustained effort that the emergency had required. Major Hoffman, who had initially questioned Flora's assignment to the crew, found himself writing what would become one of the most remarkable commendation reports in military aviation history. Specialist Garcia's actions saved 28 lives through a combination of technical expertise, physical preparation, and mental determination that exceeded all expectations. Her performance during this emergency was nothing short of extraordinary. But the most significant vindication came from an unexpected source. Captain Elena Kozlov, the Russian exchange officer who had secretly supported Flora's preparation, revealed the full extent of Flora's unauthorized training to the investigation board. The revelation that Flora had been preparing for exactly this type of scenario, despite official discouragement, transformed the investigation from a simple emergency response review into a comprehensive examination of how the military identified and developed exceptional talent. Garcia didn't just respond well to an emergency, Kozlov explained to the board. She had systematically prepared for emergencies that others couldn't even conceive. Her performance wasn't luck or adrenaline, it was the result of months of deliberate preparation that her command structure had actively discouraged. The investigation findings led to immediate changes in crew selection criteria and training protocols. Flora's techniques for maximizing mechanical advantage in manual systems became required training for all flight engineers. Her endurance conditioning methods were adopted as standard preparation for aircrew members. Most importantly, the military began recognizing that exceptional performance often came from individuals who prepared beyond minimum requirements rather than those who simply met established standards. 3 months after the Barcelona emergency, Flora received notification of her reassignment to the European Air Transport Wing's newly created Advanced Emergency Response Team. The unit was specifically designed for high-risk missions where technical expertise and innovative problem-solving were more valuable than conventional approaches. Colonel Richards, who had initially been skeptical of Flora's extensive preparation, personally delivered the assignment orders. Garcia, your performance during Flight 847 has changed how we think about aircrew capabilities. We're creating this new unit because we realize we need people who prepare for challenges we haven't even identified yet. Flora's first mission with the Advanced Emergency Response Team took her back to the same routes she had flown as a questioned crew member, but everything had changed. When she entered the briefing room, conversation stopped as colleagues sought her input on technical procedures. Her suggestions were not only welcomed, but actively requested by senior officers who had previously dismissed her ideas. The most profound change was in Flora herself. The quiet uncertainty that had once characterized her interactions with colleagues had been replaced by quiet confidence. She had proven to herself and others that preparation and determination could overcome any perceived limitation. During a crew briefing 6 months after the Barcelona landing, a young flight engineer approached Flora with familiar concerns. "Ma'am, I'm worried that I'm not strong enough for some of the emergency procedures. The other crew members seem so much more capable." Flora smiled, remembering her own doubts and fears. "Strength isn't about how much you can lift," she replied. "It's about how much you're willing to prepare, how much you're willing to endure, and how much you're willing to give when others are counting on you." As she spoke, Flora glanced around the briefing room at colleagues who now sought her expertise rather than questioned her capabilities. The journey from Noodle Arms to aviation legend had been challenging, but it had taught her something invaluable. The most powerful strength comes not from your muscles, but from your refusal to accept limitations that others place on your potential. Today, Flora Garcia serves as Director of Emergency Response Training for NATO Air Forces, developing procedures and techniques that help aircrew members exceed their perceived limitations. Her story has become required study at military academies worldwide, inspiring a new generation of aviators to prepare for challenges that haven't been imagined. Yet, the C-130 she saved that day in Barcelona now serves as a training aircraft, bearing a small placard near the flight engineer's station, dedicated to those who prove that the size of your heart matters more than the size of your arms. Flora Garcia had spent months preparing for a moment that might never come. When it finally arrived, she discovered that being ready for the impossible was exactly what made it possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.